The autumn of 1415 brought rain, mud, and misery to northern France. Yet, out of that misery, one of the most unlikely victories in medieval history was about to be forged. The Battle of Agincourt is remembered not just as a clash of armies, but as the day a weary, outnumbered, and half-starved English force under King Henry V shattered the pride of French chivalry. It is the story of how discipline, strategy, and sheer determination overcame arrogance, overconfidence, and overwhelming numbers. To understand how England's king destroyed France's knights against all odds, we must first step back into the world that produced this battle, a world where honor and lineage meant everything, where knights clad in steel were considered invincible, and where war was not merely about survival, but about prestige, dominance, and dynastic ambition. The Hundred Years' War between England and France had already raged for decades by the time Henry V ascended the throne of England in 1413. The war was rooted in disputes over succession to the French crown and territorial claims in France. By the time of Henry's reign, England's fortunes in the war had waned, and the young king was determined to reassert his claim to parts of France. Henry's first great campaign began in August 1415 when he sailed with a large army to Normandy, besieging the town of Harfleur. The siege was long, brutal, and costly. English soldiers died in droves from dysentery and disease, and when the town finally fell, Henry's forces were severely weakened. He had intended to push deeper into French lands, but with his army reduced, his supplies running low, and winter approaching, he made the fateful decision to march his men across northern France to the English-held port of Calais. It was a risky march across enemy territory, and the French were not about to let him pass unchallenged. By October, French nobles had gathered an army to block Henry's path. Estimates vary, but it is believed the French had perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 men, the majority of them heavily armored knights and men-at-arms. The English, by contrast, had perhaps 6,000 weary souls, most of them longbowmen. The French were confident. Their knights believed they would simply ride down the thin, exhausted English line and deliver a crushing defeat. For the French nobility, this was not merely about stopping Henry. It was about honor, about showing the superiority of France's warriors over what they considered a ragged band of invaders. Henry's army marched northward, harassed and shadowed by French forces. By the evening of October 24th, the two armies had drawn near to one another in the countryside near the village of Agincourt. The French occupied a position that blocked Henry's path forward, forcing him to either fight or surrender. Rain poured down during the night, turning the plowed farmland into thick, sucking mud. The French knights, who would rely on mobility, were about to find themselves trapped by the very ground beneath their feet. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic confrontations of the Middle Ages. On the morning of October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, Henry arranged his army carefully. He knew his only hope was to use the terrain and the longbow to maximum advantage. He placed his men in a narrow field flanked on both sides by dense woods, which prevented the French from fully using their superior numbers. At the center of his line were his dismounted knights and men-at-arms, forming a solid wall of steel. On either side, stretching out like wings, he positioned thousands of longbowmen, each protected by sharpened stakes driven into the ground to thwart cavalry charges. These longbowmen were the backbone of Henry's army. The English longbow, nearly 6 feet tall, could launch arrows with tremendous force, penetrating armor and striking from great distances. The longbowmen were also hardy peasants used to hard labor, unlike many of the aristocratic French knights, whose lives had been filled with privilege and ceremony. Henry himself rode before his men that morning, rallying them with words of encouragement. He was a king who fought alongside his soldiers, and they trusted him. He reminded them that they were fighting for their survival, for their homeland across the sea, and for their king's rightful claim. Whatever he said to them, it worked, because those weary, sick, and outnumbered men prepared to stand against overwhelming odds. The French, by contrast, spent the morning debating how to attack. Their overconfidence worked against them. They were so certain of victory that they argued over which noblemen would take which English prisoners for ransom. Some even rode late to the battlefield, unhurried because they believed the English were already doomed. Their army was drawn up in massive blocks of men-at-arms, supported by mounted knights. But because of the narrowness of the field and the mud, their numbers became more of a hindrance than an advantage. They were packed tightly, unable to maneuver freely. As the hours dragged on, Henry waited. He knew the French might prefer to delay, letting hunger and fatigue sap his men further. Finally, Henry made a bold decision. Rather than standing passively, he ordered his archers to advance. The longbowmen stepped forward, drove their stakes into the ground, and prepared their weapons. It was an audacious move, for it provoked the French to attack. The archers loosed their first volleys, and the sky darkened with arrows. Horses reared, knights stumbled, and chaos rippled through the French lines. The English longbow had begun its terrible work. The French knights responded with a charge. But the muddy field betrayed them. Horses slipped and struggled in the muck, armored men sank knee-deep, their heavy plate turning the ground into a trap. As they advanced, arrows rained down, striking visors, piercing joints in armor, wounding men and horses alike. Those who reached the English lines did so exhausted and disordered, crashing into a wall of determined men-at-arms and archers who fought ferociously to hold them back. The battlefield became a hell's cape of mud, bodies, and flying arrows. The French were not just fighting the English, they were fighting the very terrain. Despite their courage, the French knights found themselves pressed tighter and tighter as more of their own men surged forward behind them. The narrow battlefield and the woods on either side funneled them into a deadly bottleneck. Men fell and were trampled, drowned in mud, or crushed beneath the weight of their comrades. The English archers, once they had exhausted their arrows, waded into the fight with hatchets, mallets, and knives, cutting down armored knights in close combat. The supposed superiority of French chivalry was collapsing before the desperate fury of Henry's smaller army. By midday, the French vanguard was in utter disarray. What had begun as a confident advance had turned into a nightmare. Henry himself fought in the thick of the battle, a king covered in mud and blood, striking blows alongside his men. His courage inspired those around him, and the English line held firm. Slowly but surely, the French attacks faltered. Waves of knights were thrown back, unable to break through. The battlefield was littered with bodies, many of them nobles of France, the pride of their kingdom. As the fighting raged, Henry's men did the unthinkable. Surrounded by piles of fallen knights, they began taking prisoners. Among them were some of the most prestigious nobles of France. For the French aristocracy, it was a disaster beyond imagining. Knights who had expected to ride down peasants were instead humbled, captured, or slain in the mud of Agincourt. The pride of French chivalry had been broken, and it was King Henry V and his ragged band who had delivered the blow. The battle was far from over, but already the French were discovering the terrible cost of their overconfidence. The first waves of their knights, meant to smash through the English line with sheer weight and valor, had been brought low by mud, arrows, and exhaustion. The survivors were pressed back, unable to retreat cleanly because more of their comrades were being shoved forward from behind. In such tight quarters, heavily armored men became prisoners of the terrain itself. Some suffocated beneath piles of fallen bodies, others were crushed by the press of their own allies. Horses flailed helplessly, unable to carry riders forward, and those who fell were dragged down into the filth. The field of Agincourt became not only a place of combat, but a slow, grinding death trap for the flower of French nobility. Henry's archers, no longer content to stand behind their stakes, joined the melee. Many of them were commoners armed with whatever tools they had brought, mallets, knives, and hatchets. They swarmed into the chaos, finishing off knights pinned helplessly in the mud or slitting the throats of horses to topple riders. The idea that peasant bowmen could kill armored nobles horrified the French, but on this day social class meant little. Mud and exhaustion made all men equal, and the English were not about to show mercy in the midst of survival. Every fallen knight was one less threat to their fragile line, and they fought with the desperation of men who knew defeat meant death or worse. Henry himself remained at the center, a king in every sense. He had been struck in the face during the campaign, a scar marking his determination, but he showed no fear. Instead, he inspired his men by fighting alongside them, his sword rising and falling with the same urgency as the common soldier's dagger. Chroniclers later recorded his calm, his faith, and his conviction that victory was possible even when the odds seemed hopeless. That spirit bound his men together. They were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for a leader they believed in. The French command, meanwhile, was in chaos. Their army was so large and unwieldy that messages could not pass effectively. Nobles acted independently, each eager for glory or ransom. Some commanders threw their men forward recklessly, others hesitated, waiting for the vanguard to clear the way. Instead of overwhelming the English through coordination, they tripped over one another, their strength turned against them by poor planning and the bottleneck of the battlefield. The French knights were brave, but bravery alone could not overcome mud, arrows, and a determined enemy. By late morning, the French launched a second assault. More men-at-arms advanced, trying to push through the sea of bodies and mud. Again the longbowmen let loose, the whistle of arrows filling the air. Again horses buckled, knights stumbled, and the narrow field swallowed them whole. When some finally reached the English line, they found not a crumbling wall but a solid, defiant shield of men who had already beaten back the best France had sent. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand, face-to-face, every inch of ground contested. The English line bent but did not break. Each time the French tried to press, the weight of their own numbers bogged them down, and the English countered with daggers and axes. As if the slaughter in front of him was not enough, Henry soon faced a new crisis. A group of French cavalry, instead of charging the main English line, rode around toward the English rear. Their goal was to attack the baggage train, seize supplies, and, if possible, free prisoners or disrupt the archers from behind. For a moment, it seemed Henry might lose everything. If the rear was broken and supplies captured, panic could spread, and his fragile army could collapse. In a decisive act, Henry made a ruthless choice. Fearing that his men could not both hold the line and guard their captives, he ordered the mass execution of French prisoners. It was a shocking decision, even by the standards of medieval war, for among the captives were some of the most prestigious nobles of France. But Henry knew he could not risk having those prisoners arm themselves or rise in rebellion if the French cavalry succeeded. Under his command, English soldiers turned their blades against men who moments before had been worth fortunes in ransom. The act was brutal, pragmatic, and unforgettable. It stripped the battle of any remaining illusion of chivalry. This was no tournament, it was survival. The French cavalry raid failed to achieve its purpose. The English baggage train held firm, and the attackers were beaten back. By then, the main French army had already exhausted itself in repeated, futile assaults. The mud was thick with corpses, the cries of the wounded filled the air, and exhaustion set in on both sides. Yet Henry's men, hardened by weeks of hunger and disease, clung grimly to their positions. They had already fought longer and harder than anyone thought possible. And slowly, the realization spread through the French ranks: they were not going to win. The afternoon sun slanted over a battlefield transformed into a charnel house. Thousands of French knights and men-at-arms lay dead or dying. Their shining armor, symbols of their status and pride, had become their undoing, weighing them down in the muck, turning them into easy prey for the nimble English archers and soldiers. Among the fallen were many of France's greatest nobles, men whose names had carried honor and fear throughout the kingdom. The English, against all odds, had achieved what seemed impossible. They had not only survived, they had destroyed an army that by all accounts should have swept them away. The French losses were catastrophic. Estimates vary, but some chronicles suggest as many as 6,000 Frenchmen were killed, including a shocking proportion of the nobility. The Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Brabant, the Constable of France Charles d'Albret, and countless barons and knights lay dead. The English, by contrast, lost perhaps only a few hundred. The disparity was so great that it became legendary. How could so few have slain so many? How could a weakened army of commoners and archers humble the mightiest knights in Europe? The answer lay in the ground, the weather, the longbow, the arrogance of the French, and above all the leadership of Henry V. News of the victory spread quickly across Europe. For the English, it was a triumph beyond measure. Henry V had not only secured his army's survival, but had dealt a blow so devastating that it reshaped the war itself. His reputation soared, and even his enemies could not help but respect the achievement. In England, he was celebrated as a warrior king, chosen by God, a new Arthur leading his men to glory. For the French, the defeat was humiliating, a wound to their pride that would fester for years. The nobility who survived returned home in shame, their families mourning the countless dead. The social order of knighthood, built on the belief in the invincibility of armored cavalry, had been shaken to its core. And yet, for Henry, the victory was only part of a greater ambition. He had not crossed the Channel merely to win a battle. His aim was to secure his claim to the French crown itself, to carve out an empire that joined England and France under one monarch. Agincourt gave him the leverage he needed, showing that he could not be ignored, that his armies were capable of miracles even when outnumbered. In the years to come, Henry would press his claim relentlessly, returning to France with larger armies, forcing treaties, and nearly achieving the dream of uniting the two kingdoms. But Agincourt would remain the symbol, the touchstone of his reign. It was the day when mud and arrows defeated steel and pride, when common men stood beside their king and turned the tide of history. It was the moment when the legend of Henry V was forged in blood and courage. When the sun finally set on October 25, 1415, the fields near Agincourt were covered in a grotesque carpet of bodies. Mud clung to armor and flesh alike, horses and men lying twisted in grotesque heaps, the cries of the wounded echoing into the chill of evening. The English, though battered and weary, stood in disbelief at what they had achieved. They were not supposed to win. By every calculation of numbers and strength, they should have been crushed, yet they had prevailed. For Henry V and his soldiers, it was not merely a victory. It was vindication, proof that their struggle, their suffering, and their loyalty had been rewarded with divine favor. Henry moved among his men, offering words of thanks and encouragement. Chroniclers say he ordered hymns sung on the battlefield to give thanks to God. He wanted the victory to be remembered not as luck or chance, but as providence, a sign that heaven itself had favored his cause. To a medieval mind, this was more than strategy. It was proof of legitimacy. Henry could return to England not just as a commander who had won a battle, but as a king chosen by God, his claim to France blessed by divine will. That symbolism would prove as powerful as the victory itself. The tally of French losses grew more staggering as the field was surveyed. Among the dead lay some of the most celebrated nobles of France, men whose families had dominated the kingdom for generations. Their loss was not just military but political, a blow to the very structure of French power. The nobility, which had long seen itself as the shield of the kingdom, had been shattered in a single day. Worse still, the manner of their defeat was humiliating. To be brought down not by knights of equal standing but by mud, arrows, and common archers struck at the very heart of their identity. Honor, lineage, the prestige of knighthood, all seemed meaningless in the face of the carnage. Agincourt was not just a battle lost, it was a cultural wound. For the English, the spoils of war included prisoners of immense value. Even though many had been executed in the heat of battle, Henry still retained a number of high-ranking captives whose ransom would enrich the crown. The financial gain was significant, but the psychological gain was greater. Each prisoner was a living symbol of France's humiliation, a reminder that its greatest warriors had been forced to yield to a king and army they had mocked. Yet Henry, ever cautious, ensured that his men did not grow complacent. The march to Calais still lay ahead, and the French might rally. With discipline characteristic of his leadership, he restored order, tended to the wounded, and prepared his men to continue their perilous journey. When Henry finally reached Calais and returned to England, he was greeted as a hero. The news of Agincourt had already preceded him, carried across the channel by messengers and merchants. In towns and villages, bells rang, prayers were said, and people celebrated their king's triumph. For a country weary of war and internal strife, the victory was a source of pride and unity. Henry had not only protected English honor abroad, he had elevated it. He became the living embodiment of the warrior king, a figure who could command respect both at home and across Europe. The impact of Agincourt on France, meanwhile, was devastating. The French monarchy was already weakened by internal divisions, with rival factions competing for power. The defeat deepened these rifts, undermining confidence in leadership and shaking the nobility's authority. The loss of so many leading figures created a vacuum that destabilized the kingdom further. For the common people of France, the defeat was a source of despair, but for the English, it was a beacon of hope. The war that had dragged on for decades seemed, for a moment, tilted decisively in their favor. Yet the story of Agincourt is not only about immediate consequences, but about how the battle reshaped perceptions of warfare itself. For centuries, the mounted knight had been the supreme figure on the battlefield, his armor and lineage symbols of martial dominance. At Agincourt, that myth was broken. Archers, peasants armed with bows and knives, had brought down the greatest knights of Europe. Terrain and strategy had proven more decisive than brute force and honor. The battle revealed that warfare was changing, that discipline, technology, and the use of common soldiers could eclipse the dominance of aristocratic cavalry. In this sense, Agincourt was not just a clash between England and France, but a turning point in the history of medieval warfare. The legend of Agincourt grew in the years that followed. Chroniclers embellished details, poets sang of Henry's heroism, and in time, Shakespeare immortalized the king's speech on the eve of battle, placing words in his mouth that echoed across centuries. The idea of the band of brothers, of ordinary men united in desperate courage, became part of England's national identity. Though the speech was literary invention, it captured the essence of what Agincourt represented: unity, determination, and triumph against overwhelming odds. The myth became as important as the reality, binding the English people to the memory of that day. Henry, however, was not content to rest on his laurels. Agincourt was a stepping stone, not the end. In the years that followed, he returned to France with renewed vigor, launching campaigns that brought him deeper into the heart of the kingdom. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 represented the peak of his ambition. By its terms, Henry was recognized as the heir to the French throne, cementing his position not merely as a conqueror, but as a ruler-in-waiting of both kingdoms. It was a triumph almost unimaginable, made possible by the reputation he had earned at Agincourt. Though his life was cut short by illness in 1422, Henry's legacy was secured, his reign forever associated with that muddy field in northern France. For France, Agincourt remained a bitter memory. Yet history is never so simple as a single battle. Though devastated, the French eventually recovered, rallying under figures like Joan of Arc in later decades. The war would continue for years, its tide shifting back and forth, until France ultimately reclaimed its lands and expelled the English. But the shadow of Agincourt lingered. It served as a warning against arrogance, against the complacency of assuming victory simply because of numbers or status. It was a reminder that even the mightiest knights could be brought low by mud, hunger, and arrows. For generations after, Agincourt was studied, retold, and reinterpreted. Military historians analyzed the tactics, kings invoked its memory for inspiration, and ordinary people saw in it a tale of perseverance and faith. It became more than a battle, it became a symbol. For the English, it was a story of destiny fulfilled. For the French, it was a cautionary tale. And for the wider world, it was evidence of the changing nature of war. The battlefield itself bore silent witness. For years, Farmers in the region uncovered bones, fragments of armor, and rusted weapons as they tilled the soil. The land had swallowed thousands, and each fragment was a reminder of that fateful day. Over time, memorials and markers would be placed, but in the immediate aftermath, it was the survivors who carried the memory. Men who had stood knee-deep in mud beside their king told their children and grandchildren of the impossible victory, of how hunger and sickness had not stopped them, of how they had slain giants in steel. Those stories grew in the telling, passing into legend, shaping not only how the battle was remembered, but how nations saw themselves. Agincourt was not the final word of the 100 Years' War, nor was it a permanent guarantee of English dominance. But it stood as proof of what could be accomplished against overwhelming odds. It was proof that discipline could overcome pride, that common men could humble kings and nobles, and that history could turn in the space of a single day. For England, it was a triumph etched into memory, a source of national pride that endured long after the war itself ended. For France, it was a scar that took generations to heal. And for Henry V, it was the crowning moment of his reign, the victory that defined him for all time. In the centuries that followed, the Battle of Agincourt remained one of the most famous encounters in medieval history, and for good reason. It was not merely the scale of the victory that captured imaginations, but the sheer improbability of it. How could an army starving, diseased, and outnumbered several times over defeat the might of France's nobility? The answer lay not only in the leadership of Henry V, but in the way the world was changing, in how battles would no longer be won by brute numbers alone, but by strategy, discipline, and the will to endure. Henry V's reputation grew with each retelling. Chroniclers described him as the perfect king, pious, brave, just, and utterly devoted to his men. Whether or not every story was true mattered less than the image it created. To his people, he became more than a monarch. He was a symbol of English resilience and destiny. The legend only grew stronger after his untimely death at the age of 35. To many, his passing was seen as a tragedy not just for England but for Christendom, a life cut short at the height of its promise. Yet, even in death, Agincourt ensured his immortality. His name would forever be linked with that victory, his reign defined by the triumph that had seemed impossible. For France, the memory was far more painful. The loss at Agincourt was not just a military failure, it was a humiliation etched into the nation's psyche. French nobles struggled to explain how their proud knights had been defeated so completely by an enemy they had outnumbered. Some blamed the mud, others the rain, others still the arrogance of their commanders. Yet deep down, the lesson was clear: France had underestimated its foe. The overconfidence of its nobility had blinded them to the reality of war, where honor and chivalry meant little against strategy and circumstance. It was a lesson that would shape how they approached future battles, though the scars of Agincourt would linger for generations. As time passed, the battle took on a life beyond history. It entered the realm of myth and culture, immortalized most famously by William Shakespeare. In his play Henry V, Shakespeare gave the king words that still stir hearts centuries later: the call to the band of brothers, a speech that never truly happened but has become inseparable from the story of Agincourt. Through the power of literature, the battle became not only a national triumph, but a symbol of courage for all who faced impossible odds. Soldiers in later wars would invoke the memory of Agincourt, seeing in it the promise that the few could indeed triumph over the many if they held their ground. But if the myth elevated Agincourt to legend, the reality was no less remarkable. The muddy fields of northern France had borne witness to a clash that exposed the vulnerabilities of medieval warfare. The longbow, once dismissed by many nobles as a peasant's weapon, proved decisive in shaping the outcome. The discipline of the English formations, their ability to hold firm in the face of overwhelming numbers, revealed a new model of warfare where unity and leadership mattered more than birth and title. The knights of France had charged with confidence, but confidence could not stop arrows from raining down or mud from sucking at their horses' hooves. On that day, the old order of chivalric combat crumbled in the face of cold, harsh reality. In England, the the story became woven into national identity. Schoolboys were taught of Henry's greatness, poets sang of the courage of the archers, and the battle was celebrated in paintings and chronicles. It became a point of pride, a symbol of what it meant to be English, resilient, disciplined, and capable of achieving greatness against the odds. Even centuries later, when England faced new enemies, Agincourt was remembered. During World War II, Winston Churchill himself referenced it as a reminder of national spirit and defiance. The idea that a small, determined force could overcome a larger, stronger foe resonated across the ages. Yet it is important to remember that Agincourt was not the end of the story. The 100 Years' War continued, and though England won more victories in the years after, the tide eventually turned. By the mid-15th century, France had rallied under new leadership, inspired in part by the remarkable figure of Joan of Arc. Piece by piece, the French reclaimed their territories, and by the war's end, England held only Calais. The dream of an English king ruling France faded into history. But even in defeat, Agincourt remained untarnished. It was not about the ultimate outcome of the war. It was about the moment, the day when all odds said England should fall, and yet it stood victorious. Today, the battlefield of Agincourt is quiet, its fields green with crops instead of red with blood. A museum marks the site, telling the story of that extraordinary day. Visitors walk the land where thousands once fought and died, imagining the mud, the arrows, the clash of steel, and the cries of the fallen. It is a place where history feels alive, where the weight of what happened still lingers in the air. And as long as people remember the story, Agincourt will never be forgotten. The lesson of Agincourt is timeless. It reminds us that victory is not always about strength in numbers or wealth in arms. It is about leadership, discipline, and the will to endure when everything seems hopeless. It is about the courage of men who, despite hunger and exhaustion, held their ground and fought not just for survival, but for honor and belief. It is about how a king, once doubted, proved himself on the battlefield and secured his place in history. Agincourt stands as proof that the improbable is sometimes possible, that destiny can turn on a single day. And so, the story of October 25, 1415, endures. The day when England's outnumbered army faced the might of France and emerged triumphant. The day when the muddy fields of Agincourt became the stage for one of the most remarkable victories in history. The day when Henry V carved his name into legend. Against all odds, the King of England destroyed France's knights, and the world has never forgotten. So when we think of Agincourt, we think not only of arrows and mud, of knights and kings, but of what it represents, the power of determination, the fragility of arrogance, and the enduring truth that sometimes the few can indeed overcome the many. That is the legacy of the Battle of Agincourt. That is why, 600 years later, we still tell the tale. And it is why Henry V's name, and the courage of his men, will forever echo through the halls of history. And as we close this story, imagine the fields silent once more, the cries of the dying faded into memory, the banners lowered, the survivors marching on through mud and cold. What remains is not the carnage but the story of how, on one extraordinary day, the impossible became possible. This is the tale of Agincourt, a reminder that history is written not always by the strongest, but by those who refuse to yield.